So we're going to start with our first element, which is line. And that is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to be talking about lines. And we have three different types we're going to be talking about. We have our actual physical lines that we see in our photographs. We have what's called implied lines, and we have what's called psychological lines. So let's start with our actual lines. Actual lines are paths that connect 2 points. Right? As we can see here in this GIF, we have point A at the top left, we have point B in the bottom right, and we have this path that connects the 2 dots. What does that look like in a photograph? Perfect example are our train tracks, which you see everywhere, right? We have these 2 lines that converge on each other as they go into the photograph. So those are 2 straight lines, the actual rails themselves. And then we even have some lines within the fields there. You can see some lines following the same direction. And then we have the lines that the planks make themselves. So those are examples of actual lines. And these actual lines can be straight, like we see in this train track. They could be curved, like we see here. Or they can be both. Of course, right? We can have examples of straight lines as well as curved lines amongst them. And this will actually bring me into the next topic, which is implied lines, with this last picture of a train track. Here we see 2 sets of curvy rails, right? We've got this one on the left and the matching one on the right. So these are curvy lines, but we can still see they follow a general straight path through the center of the photograph, straight down towards the horizon. So this is what's called an implied line. Even though there's no actual line that's showing us this general direction towards the horizon, these 2 parallel curvy lines, curvy rails, they are creating an implied line down the center of the photograph. Another example of an implied line is the horizon, which I actually had just mentioned in this photograph. The horizon, of course, is our flat edge of the earth that separates whatever is on the earth, in this case the ocean, with the sky. In this case, we actually have a line that dictates our horizon. And usually we want our horizons to be flat. In this case, in this picture, the horizon actually is a little bit skewed, but essentially we have an actual physical line that separates the sky from the earth. However, we don't always have the horizon, the actual real world horizon, in the photograph. For example, here is a picture of me. It's a self-portrait. I took it on a tripod. Here, we don't actually see the line, the actual real-world line where the sky and the earth meet. We don't have that horizon. But our brains are really good at telling if our horizon in this picture is flat or skewed, I should say. In this case, we have a skewed horizon because the way I set up my tripod, I guess it wasn't completely level. So the camera wasn't level, which made it a little wonky, right? So if I go to the next picture, which is something I did in Lightroom, I rotated it to try and fix the horizon a little bit. You can see here, our brains are a little bit more happy with this one. If you look at the building, we can see the building is a little bit leaning on this one, on the original. And then we move it this way, and now it's a bit more up and down. However, our brains are still probably having a little bit of trouble for a couple reasons. We have our actual line of the road, which my body kind of cuts off here. But the road itself isn't flat. So the road is actually on a bit of a slant going down to the left. But the building, of course, is flat in real life. So it can kind of confuse our brains a little bit there. And then we also have a line formed at the bottom here with my Triumph logo. My bike in this picture was actually on its kickstand. I really should have stood it up and held it up as I took this picture. I wasn't thinking about it at the time. So since the bike is skewed off to the left a little bit, that can also cause some issues with our brain. Is this photo level with the horizon, the implied horizon, or is it not? And the last type of line we're going to talk about is what's called a psychological line. And here's another picture of that same shoot that I did. A psychological line is something that our brains pieces together, usually just with the orientation of objects in a picture. So for example, the way my bike is facing, it's creating a psychological line towards the building. My stare, my gaze, like the way my head is facing, is also creating a psychological line towards the building. And the way my body is facing, my orientation, creates a psychological line towards the building as well. If we go back to this picture, the psychological line is my gaze, which goes towards the left of the picture. But here we have 3 different sets of psychological lines, all leading towards the same thing, which is that building. One that if I had a wider lens and zoomed out a lot more, we can see we have a bunch of crows in the sky. If we could have seen a bit more of that line of crows, that would have created an implied line of the direction that they were flying. But of course, we can't really tell too much in this one. So yeah, those are our 3 types of lines. And where that really starts to show up in photography, we'll talk about this more when we talk about photography composition. But just as a little preview, we have what's called leading lines. And what leading lines are, they're these either implied or psychological lines, or even actual lines for that matter, that guide our eye through the photograph. So in this case, in this picture, our 3 psychological lines of my face, my body, and the motorcycle all pointing towards the building, it helps draws our eyes first from me, which is usually kind of like the focal point in this case, towards the building. It's very natural for our eyes to move that way. And then you can maybe even say that the pillars of the building then are slightly kind of like leading lines that lead us up towards the sky, towards the crows. That's kind of the natural path for our eye to follow. Me, which is the focal point, towards the building because of those psychological lines, and then up towards the crows. But I think a better, clearer example, I'll get back to those, is this picture of the SpaceX NASA launch. We have an example of an actual line, which is the launch itself, the reflection of that launch. So our eyes want to follow that. Our eyes usually get drawn to like the bright parts of pictures first. So this is usually the focal point, somewhere around here. Then we're going to go up and our eyes kind of follow this path. So this is an actual line that acts as a leading line as well, guiding our eyes. But we also have 2 other examples of leading lines in here. The first is the reflection in the water, because it lines up perfectly with this arc, so it naturally kind of helps guide our eyes towards the focal point and then through the image. And then also the fact that we have all these posts perfectly lined up along the reflection as well, that acts as a leading line. That just makes it very natural for our eyes to go through the picture just like this. And for these last 2 pictures, they're just here as an example to show a little bit of photography theory around lines. Usually there's a distinction between vertical and horizontal lines in one category and slanted or diagonal lines in another category. Our brains kind of associate the 2 different categories with different feelings or different moods. So it's commonly accepted that vertical and horizontal lines give us a sense of structure and stability. We generally tend to like that. So that's kind of what these trees are doing here, giving us that kind of sense of stability in this forest. Whereas here, there isn't really any straight or horizontal lines. Everything's kind of slanted. We can see that in the road and the trails. We can see that in the actual slope of the mountain itself. Even the trees just the way I took this picture, seem like they're kind of growing up and to the left. And what diagonal lines usually give us a sense of is it gives the photo a sense of being dynamic. Whether something's moving or whether something's just, our eyes don't easily rest on it. So it's more dynamic than something like this, where our eyes and our brain just kind of feels a bit more relaxed. We can kind of understand and take this in. Here, yeah, where our eyes are moving more. So that's kind of what diagonal and slanted lines try to do versus our straight, up and down, or left and right horizontal lines.